It is 1925. In Rome, a hunchbacked man rises to speak in Parliament. He weighs barely 100 pounds. His voice is weak. Mussolini sits across the chamber, heckling. The little man ignores him. "You fascists," he says. "Your ruling class is corrupt. You have impoverished the workers and the peasants alike." He is tearing apart the logic of fascism to the fascists themselves. Within a year, they will lock him in a cage for the rest of his life.
All right, that's a 1940 Italian partisan song. Randy Critico, live on the fly here on WBAI. We are being joined by Richard Wolff, the renowned economist, philosopher, historian. He wears a lot of hats. He's got a show right here every Thursday night at 7 p.m., and it is called Economic Update. His website is Democracy at Work. And a lot of books out there, and I think we'll be referring to one of them, or maybe both of them, Understanding Capitalism and Understanding Marxism. Welcome back, Dr. Wolff.
Glad to be here, Randy, and joining you and talk about one of my favorite authors.
Who's that? You?
No, it's Antonio Gramsci,
Yeah.
the fellow described in your opening clip there.
Right, you're one of my favorite authors, and so just kind of recapitulate what we talked about a little bit. We didn't get into Gramsci that much. We got into current affairs, but enough. But just to give an overview of that man in so many words, why people should read him, and the importance of his work, and why it's relevant today.
Okay. Maybe the best way is just to remind people very, very briefly of who Antonio Gramsci was and why what he says and wrote is so important. He was born, he's long dead. He was born in the poorest imaginable circumstances, a peasant family on the island of Sardinia in the Mediterranean Ocean. It was then, as it is today, a part of Italy, even though it's an island off the mainland of the Italian peninsula. He was born rather sickly. His parents did not believe that he would likely survive. In Sardinia at that time, many babies didn't live even a year long. That was a common experience of families. His was a little different because since they were so sure that he was going to die, and since they had very little money, they put that money together and purchased a coffin. And since they didn't have the money to buy a coffin and a bed, his bed in his early weeks, months, and years was to lie in his own coffin. I tell that story, as people have always done, to say that in addition to all the other problems we all have as babies, he had a physical deformity, what came to be called in common language a hunchback. He lived with that all his life. He was a small, little fellow with a big deformity on his back, and he had the psychological costs of being raised as someone whom his parents expected to see die as an infant, living in his coffin.
Wow.
Needless to say, that did not happen. He turned out to be, he lived, he overcame his problems, was so brilliant that he was sent to school. The family scraped together the money, the school fees. He eventually went on to qualify to go to the university system, and he went to a northern Italian city. If I have my memory, my details correct.
Turin.
Torino,
Yeah,
in
Torino.
Italian. That's right, Torino. The English being so dominant in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe, not particularly before that, and certainly not anymore. But in those days, if you were British, you were the king of the heap. It's a little bit like if you were an American over the last 75 years. The British have had to get used to being that no longer, and that's what's happening to America now, too, but that's another conversation.
Well,
He went to the University of Turin, where he was a brilliant young student. And then, now to get to his work, and then, as a young man, alert, reading everything around him and active, he got caught up in a very strong working class movement. You know, northern Italy, places like Torino and Milano and Verona and Vicenza, these were places, particularly Torino and Milano, of Italy's industrialization in the 19th century. By contrast, other parts of Italy, for example, Naples area or Sicily in the south, those remained overwhelmingly agricultural. Wealth accumulated in the north, and the south was much more famous because it was agrarian, because it was poor, because it was where the wine got produced, and perhaps for the mafia and so on. But the northern part became a very rich area of working class struggles to improve the condition of those Italians who came from that area and went to work in the factories, or who came north, big migration from the south to the north of Italy to work in the factories. And the number one company at that time, which is still a major important company, was the Fiat Motor Company. Fiat was a name for one of the biggest automobile manufacturers in all of Europe, but certainly the biggest one in Italy. And so many of them were workers like Gramsci in the Fiat factories of northern Italy, mostly in and around Torino. And now the key thing. Starting in the early parts of the century, in the early first couple of decades, huge labor actions, strikes, work actions on the job, organization economically into unions, but also politically into political parties, was very successful in and around the Torino factories of Fiat. And when, and this is crucial, when the workers, the Italian workers, heard about the achievements of a revolution in Russia, this was in 1917, the famous Russian Revolution, Gramsci was one of those who said to himself, as many did, if the Russians could do it, we can do it. We too can overthrow what's left of the old feudal families and power structure, and even what is the new capitalists who've replaced them. We can make a revolution in favor of and to the service of the needs and desires of the working class. And that was as revolutionary an idea for Italy at that time as it had been in 1917 in Russia. You know, Russia had also had an earlier upsurge of revolution, making what's
1905.
called the Revolution of 1905.
Right.
And so the 1917 was a second one.
Right.
And here comes the punchline. What had happened to Antonio Gramsci as he asked these questions was he found his way to the most important literature available anywhere in Europe at that time for people who wanted to develop their criticism of capitalism and their understanding of what might come next. What kind of alternative system would be better for working people? And of course, what I'm talking about is he discovered the literature of Marxism, of Karl Marx, of Frederick Engels, and of Rosa Luxemburg, and of all
It was
the
her
other,
birthday yesterday, by the way. Go ahead. Yes.
of all the of the most famous of the interpreters of Marx, and those included in Germany Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, many others. In Russia, it included Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky and many of those others. And they had people who tried to take the teachings of Marx further, to go beyond capitalism, which was no easy task to do in a world, most of which was busy becoming capitalism out of whatever existed before, feudalism, slavery, and so on. And so they got so far, and typically not far enough. That was true in Russia, later became true in China, and so on. But here we are around 1917, 18, 19, 20. And what Antonio Gramsci does, the brilliance of what he did, was to say the conditions of the working class in Italy are just as bad, just as unfair, just as desperate as they were in Russia. Therefore, if the Russians could make a revolution, ending feudalism forever and repressing capitalism in favor of a new socialist system, well, then we should be able to do it here. And he tried. He tried as part of what was then the Socialist Party of Italy, a rapidly growing party whose base was in the Italian working class in general and the industrialized factory workers at Fiat in particular. He had new ideas of how to do it. He organized, for example, what were called workers' councils. At every workplace, the workers would get together, form their own organization. This was separate from the unions. The job of the unions, in Gramsci's mind, was to fight for a better deal for workers inside capitalism. The workers' councils were to go beyond that. They were fighting to create a new society that would be owned and operated by workers together in the worker council. Indeed, the Italian phrase for worker council is translated into the Russian by the word Soviet. That's what that word means in Russian. It's a council of workers. And they were copying, if you like. But here now, to make a long story short, it did not work in Italy. Eventually, Gramsci was arrested in the 1920s. He was arrested by another socialist leader who had taken the party to the right, whereas Gramsci wanted to take it to the left. The man who took the Socialist Party to the right was Benito Mussolini. He eventually quit the Socialist Party, set up his own fascist party, and ran Italy and put Antonio Gramsci, among many others, in jail, where Gramsci spent the next 15 years or so, which was the only life he had left. He spent the rest of his life basically in jail.
Right.
A few months before he died, he was so sick they let him out. But he was basically slowly killed off by Mussolini in jail.
Right, 1937.
Now his work. The work is crucial to understand, asks the question, why, if the working class in Russia and the working class in Italy were basically in the same ripped off, exploited condition, why was it possible for a revolution to happen in Russia but not in Italy? What explains that? And his answer, which he worked on for the rest of his life, is a collection of essays that he wrote mostly during those last, whatever years it was, 15 years or so, in jail. They were smuggled out by his sister, and they were collected slowly and printed and are available today under the title Prison Notebooks, the Prison Notebooks of Antonio Gramsci. And here in the United States, they are available in a superb English translation. The collected works, the Prison Notebooks, were published by Columbia University Press here in New York City. And they were put together, some of you might find this interesting, by two men that I know real well, that I knew real well. The first volume by Joseph Buttigieg, a professor of literature at Notre Dame University in Indiana, and one of my students, Antonio Collari, who's currently a professor at a university in Pennsylvania. They did the translation. Both of them are of Italian origin. And if you thought you heard the name Buttigieg and it reminded you of the fellow who was in the cabinet recently, that fellow, his father, was the translator of Antonio Gramsci.
Wow.
The small world.
Let me ask you this, Richard. So these prison notebooks basically lays out a blueprint of this. The theme is cultural hegemony. Am I correct in saying that he's dissecting why we didn't have the revolution?
Yeah, let me make the point, because I was just getting to it. Gramsci's answer to the question history posed to him, why could a revolution happen in Russia? Why could it not happen in Italy? Here's his answer, that you need to distinguish in every society. You need to do this between the objective situation that people are actually living in, the job they have, the income they earn, the house they live in, the neighborhood, the schools. You have to distinguish between the actual situation they're in and what he and other Marxists have called the subjective condition. In other words, how do people think about their own position? You only have a revolution if the objective conditions are just shy of unbearable, or maybe are unbearable, and here comes the all-important and their brains, their way of thinking about their situation, leads them to the conclusion, it's unbearable, I am not required to submit to this, and together with other workers, we want to change society. If you can develop the subjective attitude I just described, Then you have the combination of objective conditions and subjective conditions that can make a successful revolution. So, what Gramsci did is to say, I think what happened here in Italy is that we had the objective conditions, like Russia, for the revolution to happen. We even had the instrument, the worker councils, like the Russians had the Soviets. But what was different was we had ways of thinking, another word for which is the word culture. We had a culture that worked against making a revolution, and that was strong enough to prevent one from happening.
Right.
And therefore, we need to understand that capitalism can survive even if the conditions of the working class are lousy and deteriorating, if that capitalist system can hold on to controlling and shaping how people think about the world. So Gramsci, for example, wrote unbelievable, brilliant essays showing how the music of Italy, how the rituals of the Catholic Church, how the kinds of literature that Italians loved, how the opera, that unique cultural form that is more developed in Italy than anywhere else on earth. How did these develop in such a way that they operated as brakes, as a brake in a car, holding back the forward motion of a revolutionary movement? And please remember, Antonio Gramsci took this thinking, broke away after World War I, when the Italian Socialist Party split, like socialist parties did everywhere else in the world, including the United States. And Gramsci not only went with the breakaway part of the Socialist Party that renamed itself the Communist Party, but he became the leader of the Italian Communist Party. And why is that important? Because the Italian Communist Party was the largest and most successful communist party anywhere in Europe from the end of the Second World War until literally a few years ago. But for the whole second half of the 20th century and into this century that we're living in, the Italian Communist Party was a much bigger and more successful political party in Italy than the Communist Party was anywhere else in Europe, outside, of course, of the Soviet Union. So it is an extremely important story, and an enormous literature is available for you, people listening, that was written by Gramsci and has been translated into English, for example. But there's an even bigger literature about Gramsci, because what he left us was a Marxist literature theory, a Marxist theory of the church, a Marxist theory in which he asks how these institutions fit into a society to operate as a brake on the movement towards socialism. Any successful future revolution in Europe will have to go back and ask these same questions, and Gramsci will be the guide. You'll have to build on it, we'll have to update it, but that literature is foundational.
There's one of the quotes from the book is, and this is relevant today, particularly in America. He did write, I think, a huge chapter or a whole notebook dedicated to American culture. But this one here is the challenge of modernity is to live without illusion, and without becoming disillusioned. Had a hard time reading my own handwriting.
Well, he had that insight that he understood, as we all do. We all know people in our family or a circle of friends who are disillusioned, who don't participate in rallies or movements. They're disillusioned.
Right.
What she wanted us all to understand is the way to avoid disillusionment is not to have the illusion in the first place. It's an illusion because you were illusory, you didn't understand the non reality of what you were thinking. And so when it turned out that you had an inconvenient fact, you felt not just that you had gotten some detail wrong, but that your whole approach was somehow faulty. And if you live in a society that is working as hard as this one is, that you have no idea about a better way of living, no idea about an alternative way of organizing society. If you think there's something absolutely necessary, unavoidable, permanent, that makes some people like Elon Musk have hundreds of billions of dollars and you can't help your niece get a college degree because you can't afford it. People who think these are realities are the ones holding the revolution back because they live in a world either of the illusion that if they work hard they'll get the money they need, or the delusion, if you like, and the fact that they are then disillusioned when it turns out what they believed in the first place wasn't right. It was much more the idea of Gramsci to say, well, let me give you another quotation of his. We have to look, he said, honestly and fearlessly at how the world really is. And it's pretty bad when a few people have hundreds of billions of dollars, whereas billions of people are wondering how they're going to eat tonight. That is so outrageous, but we have to face it. We can't pretend that that isn't true. Most Americans do. The polls here in America show that most Americans think they live in a society much less unequal than it actually is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So he argued what we must have, and here come his famous lines: we must have pessimism of the intellect combined with optimism of the will. We got to fearlessly look at the reality without losing the optimism that we can and eventually we will overcome this bleak reality.
Wow.
In his way, that quote can be rewritten in the African American spiritual "we will overcome."
Yeah. All right, we're going to take a quick break here, Richard, and I want to talk about one last, real quickly. Just another quote of his I wanted to quote, and that is: "In politics, the error arises from an inadequate understanding of what the state is really about."
Exactly. And a footnote here for people. The greatest Marxist work has often, not always, but often, been done when Marxists have asked themselves honestly, with a pessimism of the intellect, why a revolutionary upsurge didn't succeed. In other words, Marxism comes to its best when it answers that question. And by doing that, if I can quote Mao, you turn a bad thing, that the upsurge toward revolution was defeated, was broken, was pushed back. You turn a bad thing into a good thing by analyzing it to make sure you've learned the lessons. So, for example, the first time the working class took over a government in modern society was the Paris Commune. You and I have talked about it, the Paris Commune of 1871. in Paris, France. Well, Marx wrote a very famous pamphlet about that in which he asked himself the question, what went wrong here? Why was it easy for the right wing to come in and destroy the Paris Commune? And the pamphlet he wrote, which became a classic for all Marxists, was then picked up, no surprise, by a young man named Vladimir Lenin. Wow. And what did Lenin say? He said, this analysis teaches me how I can be more successful in trying to make a revolution in Russia several decades after Marx had died. And he did. And it worked. In a way, Gramsci was part of that tradition. Okay, if we couldn't do it here in Italy, I am going to spend the rest of my life, I, Antonio Gramsci, helping my fellow revolutionaries to understand what went wrong, what defeated us, so that we will do better next time.
Right. All right. We're going to take a quick break or station break, and I want to come back and talk about, the unemployment rate has gone up, the chaos, what it implies for the world economy with this whatever's happening in the Mideast. We'll be right back with Dr. Richard Wolff.
Libertà, sì, siamo partigiani. Fate largo che passa la brigata Garibaldi, la più bella, la più forte, la più ardita che ci sia. Quando passa, quando avanza, il nemico fugge allora, tutto rompe, tutto infrange con la forza e con l'ardor. Abbiamo la giovinezza in cor, simbolo di vittoria, marciamo sempre forte e non temiamo la morte, la stella rossa in fronte, la civiltà portiamo ai popoli oppressi, la libertà noi porteremo.
All right, Brigada Garibaldi. Have you heard that before, Dr. Wolff?
Yes, I've heard that before. And Garibaldi is worth a whole nother program.
I know. I really want to do a Garibaldi. I've read about 6 books on Garibaldi, and it's a
what Americans, particularly Americans of Italian background, should know that's the man who put together what is modern Italy. Without Garibaldi, Italy would have continued to be the small collection of little kingdoms that it was for so long.
Right.
He's the man who, leading a working class army, created the state of modern Italy.
We got to talk about him for I really have a lot to talk about with Garibaldi, but in 15 minutes we can't. I totally agree. And there's a great monument in Washington Square Park. I always stop by and tip my hat to Garibaldi. I do. And by the way, Lincoln, through Secretary of State, what was his name? I can't even think of his name. The Secretary of State at the time, Seward wrote a letter to him, and I think it was by him to Garibaldi. Maybe it was the War Secretary, but asking him to lead. This is 1861, after the reunification, and offering him a generalship. And he wrote back saying, at that point, it wasn't about liberation of the slaves. It was not that war wasn't until 1863-64 turning in that direction, and he turned it down. There's a letter, and I've got it in a book of Garibaldi's writings to William Seward. All right, so look.
A footnote 2, please.
Yeah.
The work of Antonio Gramsci is globally, it's been translated into, 50 languages. There's an international Gramsci society that holds conferences all over the place. In Rome is the headquarters of the Antonio Gramsci Society, which services the interest in his work. In American universities, if you study literature, if you study the role of literature or music or religion in the larger society, you will encounter Gramsci's work. It is interesting that even in a country as devoted to anti revolution, anti communism, anti socialism, Gramsci, his work is so good and so rich and so powerful that even here it's an important name. The only funny thing, which I have had to deal with 100 times in my life when I've given a talk somewhere, is I have to, and I always make sure to do it, to explain to them that this Antonio Gramsci, whom they are studying, whom they are writing a doctoral dissertation about, and there are thousands of those, he was the head of the Italian Communist Party for
Whoa.
most of his adult life. And they look at me, so many here in America, as if they were just told some unwanted fact that they have to now face, that the inspiration for their work, the theoretical guide to their work, the rich literature they are mining to develop their own dissertation and their own book or article, was a communist, and was the head of the Communist Party of his country.
Right. I got a feeling that Trump has not read his work.
Oh, I don't think so.
All right, so I wonder how Gramsci would view America today and what's going on. First it's Venezuela and it's Ecuador yesterday. Some kind of action. The focus will be on Cuba real soon. And now this quagmire. This growing quagmire in West Asia. How do you look at that? Where is it going, and what's the driving force behind it? Is it because of the obvious destruction of the American empire economically?
No, if I had to, it's many things, of course, but I would argue for Americans, and takes us right to today's headlines, that one of the fundamental things going on is absolutely up Gramsci's alley. Here's the reality. The level of inequality in the United States today is more powerful than we've ever had in our history. The kind of wealth played with by Bill Gates or by Warren Buffett or by Elon Musk or by Jeffrey Bezos or any of the others rivals in its distance from the average human American's experience by the difference between slaves and the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And that's how they will one day be talked about and written about. Americans know that, and they don't want it, and they don't like it. But the problem is that would be enough to make for a revolutionary change. It really would. Except that there are other things, and the capitalist system has learned how to develop and focus on religion and culture and literature, all the things Gramsci studied and how they work to hold back a revolution, they all apply here. Let me give you an example. Today, the Labor Department of the United States released its report. In the month of February, if we were to create the number of jobs necessary just to provide a job to every young person graduating high school or college, what we call new entrants into the labor force, we would need about 150,000 jobs, more or less. How many new jobs were created last month? 150 per month is what we would need, because we need 1.5 to 2 million a year. Okay. How did we do last month, February, month behind? Here's the answer. According to the Labor Department of the United States today, we lost 92,000 jobs. You understand? It's not that we didn't gain enough jobs for new entrants. We didn't gain any jobs. We lost 92,000 jobs by the end of February compared to what we had. All right, that's a sign of an economic system that isn't working very well. But look what we got. We have a leader who goes on television the other day, the State of the Union, and says the economy is great. Now, the only honest answer to that is that he must live on a different planet, because he knows the numbers of his own Labor Department better than we do. But he understands that if a person in authority says something and repeats it, and if the mass media repeat it, he can turn the heads of at least enough people in the working class who might scratch their heads and say, gee, everything I see looks like the economy's crap, but I guess I'm not seeing it correctly. Or I guess I don't have as much information at my disposal as him. Or maybe it's just the president really must know better than we do. There's and those ideas would be exactly what Gramsci would jump to. Where'd you get that idea? What kind of schooling did you have to repress your own understanding? Because it would be his way of analyzing how the culture, the schools, the newspapers, the TV, the internet, the movies, how they shape ways of thinking that would take people who would otherwise be revolutionary and make them passive and make them resigned to accepting the way the world is.
Well, are we going to pull out of this economic quagmire that we are in with this invasion of Iran, or is it going to be multiplied in the wrong direction?
Here comes the need for pessimism of the intellect. I use an intellect that was developed by the United States. I'm born here. I've lived and worked in the United States all my life. I'm a product of the so-called best schools they have. I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Those are the only universities I ever attended. I have degrees from every one of them. I'm telling you, what they trained me to do in analyzing an economy tells me that the United States is in a very bad place and the future looks even grimmer. And that half the reason we are in any war these days has nothing to do with the other side or what they did or didn't do to us. It's because you better distract the American working class from what is happening to it, because if you don't, you won't be there much longer.
Well, so far, it doesn't look promising, whatever he's trying to, his objective is in this conflict.
And the answer to that is the answer that Lenin gave when his associates in Russia back in 1917 approached him one day, a little bit before the actual revolution happened. And they said to him, "We're very depressed." And he looked at them and he said, "Why are you depressed?" He said, "Because the revolution is taking so long. It's taking so long." Kind of like you said just now. When will it happen? When will it happen? And this is the answer Lenin gave them, or at least so the story goes. Lenin said to them, "You know, you're right. For decades, nothing seems to happen. And then one day, in a few weeks, decades happen." In other words, history doesn't move in a constant rate. It is slow, then it is very fast. Then it is slow. It develops, as Marx himself said, unevenly. During all the time you think nothing is happening, things are happening.
Well, something is happening right now, and I mean, you got the Strait of Hormuz is closed. You have these Gulf gas station states.
No. But you don't have to go to that. Go to the American working class. The American working class in the largest city of this country, New York, just came off last November, having voted by a lot to put into the office of the mayor a Muslim socialist.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, suddenly I'm talking to you from Manhattan, as you know. So my mayor, the mayor of the city I'm living in, is a man who studies and identifies as a socialist. I mean, I didn't think I would ever see that in my lifetime. Here it is.
Yeah, and a Muslim at that.
And a Muslim at that. That's right.
What is that? What do you extrapolate from
The
that?
whole power structure of the city of New York, and remember, more American billionaires live in New York City than live in the rest of the country combined. So we are the center here, and we couldn't stop it. Our capitalist class, our politicians. Here's the home of most of the biggest banks in the country, many of the biggest corporations. That's why those billionaires are here. They couldn't do it because not only are the objective conditions making people very upset, but more and more the culture and the ideas and what they're told in the media and the newspapers and in school isn't persuading them anymore. So when they hear how they shouldn't vote for a socialist, they just don't pay attention.
Yeah.
It doesn't work anymore. That's what Gramsci was trying to help us understand. How do you fight at the level of culture? We've learned how to fight at the level of the factory and the office and even the ballot box with our parties. But to fight the culture, that's a whole nother enterprise. And Mr. Gramsci is the man who made the first great map of how to undertake that process.
Right. Dr. Richard Wolff, we got 1 minute here. Any final thoughts? Obviously.
Yeah, people have been very kind and to me, thanking me for the work I do with you and on my own program and so on. And I have an ego that needs stroking just like everybody else, and so I say thank you. But I want to reveal something to you. It's not me. I wish I could take the credit. I would have a bigger ego than I already do. I use Marxist theory. Why? Because giants like Antonio Gramsci or Rosa Luxemburg or Marx and Engels, these were among the smartest people. They're not the only ones, but they were smart people who asked themselves the question, how do we make society better than the capitalist employer-employee organization that we now live with? And because you have very smart people asking and answering that question, of course we have much to learn from them. And I have never had to refuse to do that. And in fact, one of the virtues of the United States is that you can do that. At least you can still do it. And so if you think what I have to say is interesting or useful, please understand that you can do it too, but you have to take a learning process from the literature of Marxism, and that includes the absolutely essential contributions of that little hunchback Italian from Sardinia, Antonio Gramsci.
All right. Democracy at Work is a website, and you can see that's where you should go because you'll see the real Richard Wolff, not that spate of AI Richard Wolff that you see everywhere. It's ubiquitous, Richard. I got to see the RW at the bottom, that it's from you, because even though maybe there needs to be some clones of you, Richard, but I got a feeling that this is being done in a very negative way, using you, saying things that you don't really say.
Okay, yes, we have these fake. Everybody like me is wrestling with that problem these days.
Yeah.
But if you go to our website, democracyatwork.info, or you go to our Substack, democracyatwork.substack.com. The work that's put up there, that's us. Now, you know it's us. It comes from us. It looks different from the AI fakes, but it's a way to be sure you're getting the real McCoy.
All right. You're the real McCoy, my friend, and we look forward to continuing this discussion every Thursday, by the way, 7 o'clock, right here at WBAI. All right, economic update, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Dr. Wolff.
When you're alone, women seem wicked. When you're unwanted, streets are uneven. When you're down, when you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange.